There's so much I could say about what the President has done, the many good things, some personal things, some things I would like to thank him for. Beginning with what I would like to thank him for, I would and am thanking him for his personal friendship. Mr. President, I can't tell you how much that friendship means to me. On behalf of the foundation, I would also thank you. You have not only attended, but participated in an active and seminal way at each of our 5 summits. I would want to thank you on behalf of the nation. During your tenure, you helped demonstrate an optimum balance between fiscal and economic leadership. During your tenure, you left us with a thriving economy, with budget surpluses, with a significant rise up from poverty, with a reduction in inequality of considerable magnitude. And it was a very interesting example of shared prosperity and opportunity. I would also thank you for demonstrating the role of bipartisanship. And none of us will forget the late 90s and the amount of involvement of your administration with the Republican leadership on achieving a balanced package that resulted, as I said, in not only a growing, thriving economy, but budget surpluses. I would also thank you for CGI and the Clinton Foundation, that I've been very happy and privileged to attend some of the meetings. And I can't believe that there aren't millions of people who have benefited from your work in that area. So once again, it's my immense privilege to introduce President William Clinton. Mr. President.
Hi, Gwen.
Hello, Mr. President. It's good to see you again. I'm going to plunge right in, because one of the interesting conversations we've been having lately in Washington and around the world is about inequality. It's back again. I went back and looked at a conversation we had on this stage 3 years ago, and we were talking about it then. Why do you think now? Why is Thomas Piketty suddenly such a big deal?
Well, first of all, it is a severe constraint on growth for the country, and it is evidence of the loss of social mobility. You just had this study last week saying that Canada's middle class may have higher real incomes than America's. We have for decades known that an economist typically break society down into 5 quintiles, that in the bottom 40% or so of the economy, there are several countries where people's real income are higher than ours. But we'd never lost the 50% before, or, in the last several decades. Now it looks like Canada may be higher. And real life is tough for people. I mean, there are lots of people that let's look at the median real income, adjusted for inflation, is still slightly lower than it was the day I left office. And the cost of education, healthcare, other things has gone up. And the average walking around person is having a pretty tough time. And it's also really put a crimp in the whole idea of the American dream, that if you work hard, you can do better than your parents did. It's clear from all the data, and it was back in a couple of years ago when I wrote that book, Back to Work, that there are 5 or 6 or 7 countries that have greater social mobility than we do. That is, where younger people are more likely to do better than their parents did. And I think that, so it's the inequality, you have to get to the roots of it. And what I tried to say before, and I'll say again, I was all for letting the tax cuts from the Bush administration expire on the top 1%, and I live in New York, which has the highest state tax rate in the country, and I live in Westchester County, which has the highest property taxes in the country. And I thank the good Lord every year I can pay them. Hillary and I have one child, and she's grown and seems to be fairly self-sufficient. I'm very proud of her, but we can't just tax our way to this. We have to reduce inequality. You have to have tight labor markets and a changing job mix. That's really the reason that in the 8 years I served, each quintile of the American economy increased in tandem more than at any time since the mid-'70s. And you can say, well, inequality still increased because the top 1% did better, but I don't think there's much you can do about that unless you want to start jailing people. But we can't, what we should be trying to do is make sure that we're all growing in real terms together, and having the right budget for the government and the right investment strategy is a part of it. But the end goal has got to be more vigorous job growth, a tighter labor market, which will raise incomes. I'm all for these raising the minimum wage. That'll help you in the bottom, and it'll levitate above, a little higher than the people covered by the minimum wage. I personally have never experienced any aggregate adverse economic impacts from raising the minimum wage. When we did it, it didn't cause any problems. I think you probably could raise it too much, and it might, but we're not in that range now. But the main thing is we need a strategy that will increase employment and change the job mix. And that's why I think this infrastructure bank issue is so important.
But Mr. President, you left office 14 years ago. We're now in the second term of a Democratic president. I'm just curious about why we're talking about this now. Why is inequality more on people's minds than it was even during a recession?
Well, because I think during the recession, if you're in the middle of the ocean and you think you're drowning, nobody wants to have a discussion about how you should have a better swimming pool in the backyard. I mean, in other words, I think we were just so glad the wheels didn't run off, and they could have. And I have said this several times, I'll say it again. I did not agree with President Bush's budget policies or the regulation policies of the SEC and others, but I think once this deal happened, he did a good job. He got aggressive. He tried to save the worst from happening, and he knew it was unpopular, and it was certainly unpopular with President Obama's political base to do what he did. And I think that in the beginning, they had to stop the train from running off the tracks. And then once you do all that damage, it takes a long time. We had financial crises in 1873 and 1893. They both took 10 years to get over. And keep in mind, in the context of the global economy then, we were China. That is, we were, relative to other countries, we were rising like a rocket. It still took us 10 years to get over. And that's what's been so challenging about the subject that brings everybody together here at the Peterson Foundation. We have a long-term debt issue. We have long-term age distribution issues aggravated by the fact that we have not passed immigration reform, which I think would ease a lot of these other problems. And but people are now, they're worried about inequality because they don't think we're going back to a crash and things aren't getting better fast enough. That's why I think this is, I wish it had happened earlier, but I'm glad we're worried about it now.
I guess I am trying to figure out how reducing the debt, raising the minimum wage, and passing immigration reform are not a zero-sum game. How are those things not at war with one another?
What, on the theory that if you have more workers, it'll be a downward pressure on wages? Well, for one thing, a lot of those people are here anyway. And if you legalize them, more will pay taxes, and they will alleviate the income stream part of the deficit problem, and you'll have more balance, and they can be brought into the effort that is now being made. I'm quite encouraged, actually, about some of the education and training efforts that are being made around America today. This movement toward universal preschool education is very important in a country with a lot of low-income people who won't get the stimulus they need. The kids won't at home. What Hillary calls the word gap, there'll be this 30 million word gap for the average poor child when he or she starts to school. I think there are lots of movement now to bring back technical and career education, and not at the exclusion of academic preparation, but integrated with it, and I could give you 10 examples that are encouraging to me. So I think it's healthy we're worried about inequality now, but we got to figure out how to fix it, and how to fix it is, it's people like me, people in upper income groups, should pay the lion's share of taxes for the same reason Willie Sutton robbed banks. That's where the money is. And if you have prolonged inequality, you're going to concentrate wealth, and then if you have to get tax money, that's where you have to go get the tax money. But we do have on the individual side, we've got quite a progressive tax system now, but we're not producing enough jobs.
So you think tax reform is an integral part of this?
No, but I think I wouldn't wait. I'm afraid with this tax reform thing I understand why everybody wants to do it, but I'm afraid we're making the perfect the enemy the good. I think they ought to isolate the corporate issue, go and reform corporate taxes. And let me plead guilty here because somebody will point it out. I raised the corporate income tax, or at least I asked Congress to its current level. When I did it, however, it was exactly the average of the wealthy countries in the world. 35% was exactly the average. And most other wealthy countries had the same system we did. Lots of deductions, lots of credits, high rates, and we were in the middle, and it worked like a charm. Now we've got over $1 trillion being held by American companies overseas because we kept this system. Everybody else got rid of a bunch of their deductions and went to lower rates, so that the average now is, Erskine's over there, he knows it's something like 25 or 26%, 24%, something like that. And we are now the only wealthy country that taxes corporations on the money they earn somewhere else when they bring it home. If you earned it in Ireland and you paid 12.5%, and you bring the money home, you're supposed to pay the difference between 35 and 12.5. No other country now does that. At the time we did it, it made all the sense in the world because everybody followed the same system, and there was no disincentive to repatriating cash. Now, this would really help us with the deficit if it works. I've had any number of executives tell me, well, let me back up. The Democrats and Republicans tried this under President Bush, and they got burned. Do you remember this? They passed a bill that had bipartisan support to let companies repatriate the money for paying, they paid 5.75%, I think. And all the money went to dividends, stock buybacks, and essentially management, top management. There was almost no money reinvested in the economy. But look at the time it was done. There was no perception that there were a lot of investment opportunities. I believe if we repatriated the money now on terms that required let's say 10% of it to go into an infrastructure bank with a guaranteed rate of return, tax exempt of X, whatever it is, as a first step toward corporate tax reform, you could get a lot of that money back in America, turn it over, increase economic growth, and launch the infrastructure bank with an adequate level of capital. Then I believe a lot of the Republican members of Congress who are disinclined right now to put any federal matching money in would do so. And keep in mind, America looks like a lot better deal to a lot of American corporations now. If you're in manufacturing, our wages are competitive. Costs the Germans $67 an hour a worker to build a car there. And if their proposed reform in Tennessee had passed, the Volkswagen reform, it would have taken their labor cost up to $27 an hour. So it's not like our labor costs are out of line. Our energy costs are way cheaper. I haven't heard anybody debate this, but there's a big debate going on here. It's a big debate going on about whether our government should facilitate the export of American natural gases in liquefied form, and all the gas people want that because they can earn more money somewhere else, or we should slow walk that so there'll be more cheaper gas available to restart manufacturing in America. And I suppose we don't have time to go into all that, but let me just say, I think manufacturing is ripe for a revival here. It is true that manufacturing jobs cannot bring us all the way back because it's the most productive part of the economy, but every one of them creates 2.5 other jobs in the economy. So I would start to go back, and I think it'd be good for the deficit because revenues would go up as income goes up.
I like the way you come back around, Mr. President, eventually.
Yeah, that's what I think, but I think we should start with corporate tax reform, and it might actually work. The whole concept of an alternative minimum tax might work better with corporate taxes than it does with individual taxes. I mean, there are lots of options here, but I think it's a mistake to put it off until we have the ideal individual income tax system and everything else. And I'm sure I'm making a bunch of people in Congress that have been working on this for years mad, but we got to unlock this money. It's $1 trillion, for God's sakes. And it looks to me like people really do want to bring it home and put it to work, and that would help spark growth.
One of the other conversations we're having in Washington is relitigating the financial collapse in 2009, in part because of Tim Geithner's new book. And one of the questions people raise is whether in your administration you didn't create policies that allowed deregulation to go too far.
Well, I think the answer to that is by and large no, but in one case yes. Let me tell you exactly what I mean by that. Nobody has identified a single financial institution that failed, not one, because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. Not one. Lehman Brothers was an investment bank. Bear Stearns was an investment bank. The non-diversified banks themselves, if you look at what happened in the years afterward, they were more likely to fail than the diversified ones. Canada got through the financial crisis probably better than any other country. They always had unified banking between investment and commercial banks. What did they have that we didn't? More adequate capital requirements, more adequate oversight. So if I had known that basically we would see the end of banking and SEC oversight after I left office, would I have signed it? Probably not. Would it have passed? Absolutely. Let me remind you, that bill passed 90-8 in the Senate. Ted Kennedy voted for it, Pat Leahy voted for it, Jay Rockefeller voted for it. I mean, there was, and in fairness to them, that's because Federal Reserve rulings, unnoticed by anybody in America, had abolished the wall between investment and commercial banking long before the bill passed. All the thing the bill did was let Citibank write insurance. I mean, really, as a practical matter, beyond what, and it made it clearer and easier and less hassle for financial institutions to do that. So I don't think that had anything to do with it. However, at the end of my term, a bill passed where, with a provision stuck in at the end, again, it passed with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. So if I had vetoed it, it would have immediately been overridden, that basically precluded the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and anybody else from regulating financial derivatives. And I thought it was a mistake. At the time, we had a great argument. Alan Greenspan and I did about it. I'll never forget. He said, But all these people, they have to have $100 million. They don't need. My argument was we ought to trade derivatives, financial derivatives, on the same basis that we trade agricultural derivatives. If you think derivatives are bad per se, look at your dinner twice tonight. We couldn't bring in a farm crop in America without derivatives. But the agricultural derivatives are traded in an open exchange with adequate capital requirements to sustain the loss that you risk. And this is not practical in financial terms, I suppose. Either one side of the trade at least has to have some stake in agriculture, has to have some skin in the game. That's what I think the law should be. And at the end of my term, if I had it to do again, I'd veto the bill, even though they would have passed it over my veto in a heartbeat, just in the hope that these financial derivatives, which then were something like $100 trillion, or whatever there was, a lot, but not very much in the context. By the time the crash occurred, they were 7 times as large as they were on the day I left office. And I wish I'd vetoed that just to start the debate. Even though it wouldn't have changed the law, it would have been a good thing to make people think about it. I love this Dodd-Frank bill finally got, thanks to former Senator Lincoln's amendment, tried to put the regulation of financial derivatives back on the table. That needs to be done, and I regret that. But otherwise, getting rid of Glass-Steagall didn't have anything to do with the crash, and I don't think would have prohibited from happening if I had vetoed the bill and let them override it. But just don't forget, it passed with 90% of both houses. Everybody acts like I sat in the closet and sort of hitched up things and, what can I do for Wall Street today? This thing had quite a head of steam. And there was no evidence that there was any problem with it.
Do you think that the rhetoric, someone who's elected as a centrist Democrat, do you think that the anti-Wall Street rhetoric is running too hot now?
Not exactly, but I think here's what the problem is. It's okay to say that too much of our growth has been concentrated in finance. I believe that. I've been saying that for well over a decade. Why? Because finance is an intermediary function in society. So if too much income is generated in any country from finance, as a percentage of the whole, it by definition means that more money is being made from trading and less money is being made from investment. And you can see that has happened. And I personally believe that's not particularly healthy, which is why I want to see this investment bank set up. But I think that what the government has been doing, it's interesting in the last few years, underneath all the rhetoric, is actually now continuing to pursue cases that took years to analyze and going after specific examples of alleged wrongdoing and trying to resolve them. That's what I think should be done. But I don't think it's a bad thing that America has efficient capital markets and that we can aggregate capital and spend it well. I think what has happened, going all the way back, starting in the 70s, is that finance has come to occupy too big a percentage of our overall GDP growth, and we have devoted too much income-generating activity to trading as opposed to investment that creates new businesses and new jobs. And we need to figure out how to tweak that. I realize it's almost irresistible to have a villain. There doubtless are some and have been, but by and large, if you were running one of these operations and that's where the money was and your job was to make as much money as you could, you'd probably do it. We should change the oversight, change the rules, and change the incentives, and you will get the desired results, I believe.
Which sounds like changing the structure, but our economy is so different from the 1990s now. I wonder if that difference is driven by the structure or whether it's driven by the politics which underpin the structure and make the solutions difficult to attain.
Both. But let me be very explicit. When I went to law school 40 years ago, and I took corporate law, which is the course I made my highest grade in, and the guy who taught me tax, which is the course I made my lowest grade in. And he said, how could you be so bad in tax and so good in corporate law? I said, because corporate law is like politics. There's an arena, there's competition, somebody's got to set the rules. I said, tax policy is just the government's trying to get more money and the people trying to pay less. And you come up with all these rules and deals, and they don't really make any sense. You just do the best you can. And I said, it's just pretty boring for me after 10 or 15 minutes. But if you go back to the 70s, we were still taught corporate law as we had been, my predecessors had been in the 30s. The corporations were creatures of the state, enjoyed certain legal benefits, including immunity, and in return for that, acquired certain obligations to their shareholders, to their employees, to their customers, and to the communities of which they were a part, more or less in equal balance. The globalization of the economy and other changes and a relentless effort to create these changes began in the 70s, a process which continues to the present day, which says the corporation owes way more to its shareholders, and therefore managers should be compensated based on how the shareholders do, than even to its customers, much less its employees and the communities of which they are a part. And if you don't like it, you're just a troglodyte, not part of the global economy. So, I noticed there's this activist investor going after Dow Chemical because he wants to be paid within a year. And he wants them to sell off an otherwise highly profitable and critical part of the company because it takes 5 years or more to build a chemical plant, and he doesn't think the precious investors ought to wait there. Until recent times, we just said, well, take your money and invest it in some other company. You don't have a right to break down a critical part of the American, indeed the international economic system. So I think this goes beyond political parties and tax policies, and it goes to the very heart of this. And some people in American legal circles now and economic circles are trying to get us to revisit this and at least think public policy ought to favor corporations that recognize multiple obligations and not just trading. That predated the advent of supply-side economics, which, as all of you know, I think triggered all this debt problem we're dealing with today. But I think that we need a balanced growth strategy. We are in trouble. Before the financial crash, almost all of our growth had come from housing, finance, and consumer spending in the first decade. And it wouldn't generate enough jobs. It just generated maxed out credit cards and stagnant incomes. And I want to inject another, since we're in Washington, inject another controversial issue here. I think that one of the things that has contributed mightily to increasing income inequality and the stagnation of the middle class is the breathtaking gap between what we spend on health care and what everybody else does. Because there are any number of small businesses in America who would love to have paid their employees a wage in various years over the last 10 or 12 years, who spent it on their health care premiums instead, and most of their employees wanted it because it was a tax-free benefit, but it's a hell of a way to run a railroad. And the most encouraging thing about the last 4 years is that the percentage of health care aggregate spending has dropped from 17.8% of GDP down to 17.2%, in spite of the fact that we got millions more insured and saved $10 billion for seniors by closing the donut hole.
What do you attribute that to?
Huh?
What do you attribute that decline in healthcare costs to?
Well, part of it was, in fairness, to the aftermath of the crash. And a lot of people were scared and poor and put off going to the doctor. But a lot of it is changes in the delivery system. You know, McKinsey did a 3-year study that came out 3 or 4 years ago. So all the numbers are out of date, but the trends were pretty good, on analyzing the difference in what we spend and what other countries spend. And they found that the biggest factor was that we pay for procedure while other countries pay for performance. And we do it also as the only country in the world without a health care budget, because everybody was scared of having one because we'd all be criticized for rationing health care. So we do more rationing of health care than any country in the world, but nobody gets caught doing it. Now that's all changing. We're building a system for the first time, and with all of its flaws and all of its imperfections, it is giving us the chance to bring our health care costs in line with our competitors. We're fighting the aging of the baby boom generation, which will screw things up for 25 or 30 years, and then when all of us are gone, I'm the oldest of the baby boomers, I can say this, we'll have a better demographic balance for another 30 years and things will begin to right themselves. But we have got to have a healthcare delivery system that gets better results and is more in line with what our competitors pay. It'll always be a little higher because we have decided that we want more technology, and we have decided that we think doctors and other healthcare personnel should be paid more. But we have also decided we can save a heck of a lot of money in other areas. And to me, that is potentially by far the most hopeful outcome of this whole healthcare reform thing, which is why all of you, whatever you think of the bill, should be focused on improving it instead of repealing it. The worst thing we could have done was keep going with this renegade, out-of-control system that was, by the time President Obama signed that bill, we were spending 17.8% of health care, and no other big rich country is spending more than 12.8%. And if you translate it into the GDP numbers today, that is more than $1 trillion a year. That's $1 trillion every year, not the one-time $1 trillion in corporate cash we have offshore.
Mr. President, you and I have been talking about health care in one form or another for 20 years, probably. Hillary care, Obamacare, you name it. So here we are in the middle of another midterm election where, as far as I can tell, Democrats are running as far as possible in the opposite direction from embracing the improvements you say that the Affordable Care Act have yielded. What is your advice to them?
Well, the ones, I wouldn't do it, but there may be some places where the well's been so poisoned they have to do it. But I think that...
Like Arkansas?
No. Absolutely, actually not. My governor, my Democratic governor in the state that has moved furthest from Democrat to Republican in the country in the last 8 years, his approval rating has never gone below 66%. And normally is around 70. And he figured out how to take the Medicaid expansion and get the Republicans to vote for it. And under our laws in Arkansas, it takes 75% of the legislature to approve even a federal appropriation of money. So to pass this, since we have a Republican legislature, he had to get 100% of the Democrats and a majority of the Republicans to support converting the Medicaid expansion into a private insurance premium. And because we're a little state and Blue Cross didn't want Arkansas to reject Medicaid and force it to raise everybody else's premiums, they gave him a real good price. It's barely more than the paperwork cost of the conversion. And we're off to the races. We're doing well there. So what I advise the Democrats to do is talk about the good things that have happened under the bill, acknowledge the problems, and say, let's do what sensible people would do. We had a problem we had to deal with. Albert Einstein couldn't have done it perfectly the first time. Now let's set a long-term repair process. I'm actually somewhat encouraged. I'm sorry Senator Portman left before we started this, but I noticed the other day that Democrats and Republicans in Congress had actually agreed to fixing one of the small business requirements of the health care bill. And it was fascinating because the Republicans didn't want to get caught agreeing, and the Democrats were afraid to be caught like admitting they made an error, so they tried to make an agreement in secret, which I think they should have been trumpeting to the hilltops. Nobody could have done this perfectly. And that's what they ought to do more of. They ought to have a special committee that works every year in getting bipartisan improvements to keep this process going.
Doesn't sound like much of a bumper sticker. Nobody could have done this perfectly.
Maybe, but I find people are pretty smart about it. You know, when you remind people that you got 100 million people now who can afford insurance because their pre-existing conditions can't be used against them. You got 100 million people who can get preventive benefits in their health insurance policies that they couldn't before. You got 3.5 million young people under 26 getting covered on their parents' policies. You got the donut hole in the senior citizens drug program has been closed, and they've saved $10 billion in drug purchases already. Seniors have. You have, I think, around 4 million people already in the Medicaid expansion, and eventually these other states, I think, will come along. It's crazy not to do it. And you've got, 8 million people who've bought insurance off the exchange, at least just under 6 million of them new insured. So I think we're rocking along pretty good here. And we did all that, added all those people, and the percentage of our GDP on healthcare goes down. Everybody else is still rising. We might actually meet somewhere in the middle in the next 5 or 10 years, and America will have no competitive disadvantage because of what we spend on healthcare. It's a beginning. And I think that the people can handle the truth, talk about what's good about it, talk about the remaining problems, commit to fix the problems. That's the best political position.
What else should Democrats be running on this year?
Reviving middle-class incomes, reducing inequality through growth. And, you know, I also think it's interesting, we actually got a budget this year. And if I were a Democrat, I would point out that the Republican budget still has a lot of problems that would make inequality worse, in my opinion. It wouldn't make growth faster. And Patty Murray proved that we will pass a budget which would keep bringing the debt down and bringing the deficit down, which is half of what it was at its peak. I think it's unlikely in an election year you're going to get a long-term fix on this, but whatever long-term fix we adopt won't work unless we do something about health care anyway.
Can I ask you about a couple of issues on the foreign policy front? Because if you were president now in the second half of your second term, and you were facing down the Russian bear, and there was a humanitarian crisis in Syria, and terrorism on the rise in Nigeria, and the Middle East peace talks had just collapsed, and they were raising Benghazi again as a foreign policy issue, in what order would you try to tackle them? And is any of it leave room for growth or hope or possibility?
Well, I don't think Benghazi is a whole different deal.
I know, but I just threw it in there.
We did, in my opinion, Hillary did what she should have done. She impaneled a very high-level review committee with the immediate past chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, who's backstage, and Tom Pickering, our country's most distinguished senior diplomat, who's worked for more Republicans than Democrats in his life. And they looked into what was wrong. They gave 29 recommendations. She took them and started implementing them. And they established the fact that whether it was right or wrong in the past, secretaries of state never were involved directly in these security decisions. And they also have untangled what was an early mystery at Benghazi, when all we knew was that 4 people were killed, and we know now 2 of them were heavily armed CIA contractors who were military combat veterans, and they were part of a group of 20 authorized to provide security, among other things, where they were in Benghazi. And it's nowhere, and the last time we had one of these things made public was when I did it after the Africa embassy bombings in 1998. And so most Americans don't even know how many American diplomatic personnel were killed when President Bush was president. They don't know what, if any, after action review was done, what, if any, recommendations were made, what, if any, action was taken to implement those. So I think my advice to everybody involved is to be not defensive and realize what this is and just answer the questions.
What is it?
No, you just want me to get in a political fight. I'm not running for anything. I'm not doing that. But, you know, Chris Stevens was the most popular foreigner in Libya. Let me remind you of this. A lot of people have forgotten this. When he was killed by that one militia group, unarmed Libyan citizens stormed the offices of two militia groups in Benghazi and forced them to give up their arms. There was an article in the paper yesterday or the day before about how Benghazi is booming again with commercial life and dangerous. That is, when you take the veneer of Gaddafi's dictatorship off of Libya, you're going to have a mess on your hands until a lot of it gets sorted out, where good and bad things will be happening side by side. And he knew as much about it as anybody and made the decision that he would go. And no one had advance notice that this was going to happen, as nearly as I can tell. So I just think we should let the report speak for itself. Now, these other things are very different. I think Ukraine, the success of the protests was so great that they had made an agreement, the reform leaders, with the outgoing president, Yanukovych, about what changes were going to be made, and he up and left the country. Let's not forget that. Mr. Putin tries to make it out like he was run out. He might have been run out, but he wasn't run out by armed mobs. He was run out because he was being found out. And 83% of the Ukrainian Rada voted to remove him or to approve his removal, even the members of Yanukovych's own party. So this was very disorienting. So Putin saw an opportunity to stir things up in Crimea and to claim that ultra-nationalists in Ukraine were doing this, and poor Yanukovych was the victim of a coup and all that, and staged that referendum in Ukraine. In Crimea, did you see the report that the Russians posted on the Crimean elections? They took it down in about 35 seconds, but basically they published a report on the elections contradicting their own report, saying that only 55% of the people voted, and it was virtually a 50-50 vote. I don't know what the real vote was, but I thought it was a hoot that somehow some mischievous Russian gave them a little of their own medicine and put that up. Putin wants to reestablish Russian greatness not as the Cold War, but in 19th century empire terms. He believes Russia was badly damaged and humiliated by the collapse of communism, the end of the Warsaw Pact, the loss of control of their near abroad. And he sees all these things in zero-sum terms. The Ukrainian reformers had a different idea, and most of the Western Ukrainians seemed to agree with them. They said, you know, we really want to be friends with Russia. We want to get along with them. If you don't think they do, look at the map. I mean, would you want to have a hostile relationship with Russia if you were located where Ukraine is? But they said, we want to be a bridge between Europe and Russia. And it was just outside of his imagination zone, and so we are where we are. It's not the end of the world. He invaded Georgia, too, and took part of that. I don't agree with this, and I think we have to be firm against it, but it's not the end of the world.
You know, I asked you about a lot of things in one question, but I guess the overarching question for all of them, all of these issues, is what does a U.S. president or a U.S. government do in these situations anymore? As you know, this president comes under fire for being too weak to act. Is there something else, another approach? Should we have even tried to convene another set of Middle East peace talks? Should we have tried to drive Assad from office? What is the U.S.'s role?
Well, first of all, I think what we should recognize is we're living in a world with much more diffuse power centers, in which we're in this catch-22 because there are very few problems we can solve by ourselves, and very few problems that can be solved without our involvement. So we're always being pressed to be more and more involved, knowing that depending on who else goes along for the ride, we will succeed or not, and knowing that the span of our control is subject to being undermined. You read that Moises Naam book, The End of Power. It's really not about the end of power. It's about the diffusion of power sources. So that's the first thing. I believe that our policy should be to try to build up the positive forces of interdependence, try to reduce the negative ones, whenever possible, do it with partners, and recognize that you are not in full control of events. Does this fight in South Sudan, which is heartbreaking to those who care about that little country, but does it mean that we made a mistake to try to help them attain their independence and end their misery vis-a-vis the Sudan? I don't think so. Does the failure of the Myanmar government to reconcile with and provide fair treatment to the Rohingya Muslims mean that we would have been better off when it was going on before in the most closed military dictatorship in the world? I don't think so. They've actually signed agreement to reconcile with 17 other armed ethnic groups, and they're proceeding. It means that Rome wasn't built in a day. Democracy building is hard work. It's not just one election. It's minority rights. It's individual rights. It's the rule of law. It means that all this stuff is a work in progress. Now, the Middle East peace process is a different thing. There are more settlers on the West Bank than there were when then Prime Minister Ehud Barak said yes to the peace proposal I made, and Mr. Arafat didn't. A lot of people have forgotten this, but 4 days before President Bush proposed his roadmap, Arafat said, "Oh, let's do the Clinton deal." By then he had a government that wouldn't give it to him and people that didn't trust him. So they've always been like ships passing in the night. I think that for whatever reason, that President Abbas has concluded that this deal he made with Hamas is either designed to put pressure on Israel to come back to the negotiating table, or designed to recognize that they can never really make a peace unless they can offer a united Palestinian position, which would cause Hamas to renounce terror in return for a state on the West Bank and Gaza. Or the third option is they don't think they're ever going to get it because security is pretty good for Israel now. They've got the pressure down, and so they want to get as much international legitimacy and support as they can. It is too soon to say what is going on, I think. At least I don't have any access to intelligence. All I know is what I read and observe. But I think I wouldn't, none of this really bothers me all that much. I wish it hadn't happened, but it's the price of being a force for peace and freedom and progress in the world. President Obama's also succeeded in his goal of doubling our exports, hasn't he? I mean, we also have done a good job, I think, in trying to help the Asians from the smaller countries at least have their interest heard and not just be run over by China, as you see in these latest little conflicts between Vietnam and the Philippines and China. Our neighbor in Mexico, thanks to our ongoing constant partnership with them, is now graduating 114,000 engineers every year with 140 new tuition-free universities. That's on a per capita basis 3 times as many as we are. That means that our ongoing efforts to be a good neighbor and a good partner to them are positive. I think that if you can't just have a laundry list of problems in the world and say, there they are, and we didn't make them go away in 48 hours, therefore we don't have a good foreign policy. And I think the president, keep in mind, we just spent a year when we were banging the living daylights out, well, not we, but the debate was banging the daylights out of him for staying in Afghanistan too long, having too many drone attacks, doing too much on intelligence. So he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. That's the world we're living in.
I have two more questions for you. One is about immigration, one's about health care. The one about immigration, Tom Donahue, the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you may have heard about this, gave a speech this week in which he said if the Republicans can't get immigration reform passed, quote, they shouldn't bother to run a candidate in 2016. He backpedaled on that a little bit afterward. But is he right?
Well, I wish he were, but I fear not. Look, here's the problem. Immigration reform has been, the Republicans did a lot to build up their Tea Party base by being against illegal immigration and making it look like the barbarians were at the gate. And we just sort of missed the fact that in 2010 and 2011, for the first time in my lifetime, there was no net illegal in-migration from Mexico. Why? Because Mexico and Brazil, at the beginning of this century, two of the most unequal countries in the world, were two countries that succeeded in reducing income inequality in our first decade, partly in Mexico's case through this explosion of new universities and education and finding employment. We know about the narco violence. The crime rate and the murder rate in Mexico went down outside the narco corridors. And so we act like everybody's just busting a gut to get here, and we just got to swat them away. That was the narrative that helped build the Tea Party support. Furthermore, I thought that guy in Texas, I can't remember, that worked for the Attorney General's office, did you see that after the voting rights decision? And they went out and implemented all their voter restriction laws. And he basically said, we are not racist, but we are trying to make it harder for African Americans and Hispanics to vote. But he said, it's not because we're racist, it's because they don't vote for us. If they voted for us, we'd be happy to let them vote. And you're laughing, but it's the world we're living in. They have decided that we only want immigration reform so we'll have more Hispanic voters and now Asian voters, and we'll build our presidential year advantage. There are 50 million people who regularly vote in presidential elections and don't vote in midterms. It's the Democrats' curse. So a lot of them have decided that they'll try to make the presidential election look more like the midterm elections with all these voting restrictions. And immigration reform could really mess that up if it contained a path to citizenship. Obscured in all this is the fact that the demographics of America are good only because of immigration. That most people who have achieved middle-class lifestyles and live in America are not having babies at more than replacement rate, not at growth rate. And that we need young immigrants not only because of their ideas and their energy, just to continue to grow the economy. People in places like rural West Virginia, Ohio, or North Arkansas, where they hadn't had a lot of new jobs in recent years, see immigrants as people taking jobs from them. But the truth is that if we did immigration reform right, it would create more jobs and create more jobs for all Americans if we did other things. That's not why they're in trouble. They're in trouble because what they used to do can't be done anymore, and nobody's brought them something new to do, or trained them to do it, or provided the capital for people to start businesses to do it. It doesn't have anything to do with immigration, in my opinion. So I'd like to see immigration reform, but it has to be seen as an economic issue, and the Republicans need to do more like what both Presidents Bush did. They weren't afraid to go out and try to get Hispanic and Asian and African American votes, and they realized they didn't have to have too many to be competitive. And so I think, that's an ugly little secret. We need to get this out. A lot of this is about the last House Republican immigration reform plan said, how about this? We'll let them stay here and work legally and have a green card, and they can never, ever, ever become citizens. Will that solve the problem? So that's what's going on. And I think we ought to adopt immigration reform. And ironically, if the Republicans did it, it would put them in a position to get a higher percentage of Hispanic votes. because, their small business rhetoric, their family responsibility rhetoric, all the stuff that they care about would be quite appealing to a lot of hardworking Hispanic immigrants. And I think it's really important. It's a demographic issue. Having lost it, I can tell you, youth matters. And we are the youngest of all the wealthy countries except for Ireland. And we were about to be younger than China had the current president not changed the one-child policy. We need this, and it's economically and socially good for us, but it's politically troublesome for the Republicans for the reasons I said. And I'm sympathetic with the people that are over there on their side trying to figure out how to make this work. But it's a political problem for them. But I think if they did it, they would be net ahead. So I guess I should hope they don't do it. But it's good for the country. It's the right thing.
Final question, and depending on how you answer it, has to do with health, but it's about your wife's health. Karl Rove asked yesterday, or raised the question over the weekend, I guess, about whether Hillary Clinton is well enough to run for president in 2016 and whether, in fact, she had suffered a brain injury. Dr. Rove wants to know, as much as we do, whether that's true and whether it will affect her decision-making.
Well, first of all, I got to give him credit. That embodies that old saying that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. First, they said she faked her concussion. And now they say she's auditioning for a part on The Walking Dead. I mean, whatever it takes. Look, she works out every week. She is strong. She's doing great. As far as I can tell, she's in better shape than I am. She certainly seems to have more stamina now. And there's nothing to it. I was sort of dumbfounded. They went to all this trouble to say that she had staged what was a terrible concussion that required 6 months of very serious work to get over. Something she never lowballed with the American people, never tried to pretend didn't happen. Now they say she's really got brain damage.
You think they're just trying to...
If she does, then I must be in really tough shape because she's still quicker than I am.
Do you think this is their way of inserting her age or her physical capabilities into the 2016 debate?
I don't know, but if it is, you can't be too upset about it. It's just the beginning. They'll get better and better at it. I mean, I'm still waiting for him to admit there was nothing to whitewater. I mean, it's just part of the deal. You can't. When a question is asked, it has to be answered in a serious fashion. If it raises a serious issue, even in a ridiculous way. After that, you just have to trust the people and go on and get back to the business of what's really in the public interest. And I'll just say one other thing, but the thing I like about this Peterson Forum is I know a lot of people think that we should have stopped talking about the deficit and the debt when the economy was down. Every time I have come here, I have said that you can't get rid of the deficit or balance the budget when interest rates are lower than inflation, because anything you cut back, you're liable to lose more. You can't do it by tax increases. You can't do it by spending cuts alone. You just can't. On the other hand, to pretend that there are no long-term demographic changes or healthcare drivers here is crazy. And I think that continuing to focus on things like this matters. And I think the effort that one of the things the Peterson Forum has done, and it's really important now because there's been a little spike in health spending this year, is it keeps us focused on these things that will shape the possibilities for America in the future. We've taken down the low-hanging fruit, most of it, in the deficit reduction effort because of growth. If we have some more growth, we'll take down some more of it, and then we'll have left to deal with the demographics and the fact that healthcare costs in America are out of line with our competitors. and we'll have to deal with how we're going to deal with our investment needs, which is why I'd like to see it. I tried when I was president. I never said this here before, and I got laughed at by even my own economist. I mean, what did I know, right? I always thought America should have a capital budget. I always believed that the bond markets would price it differently if they saw that we had an infrastructure budget designed to maximize the efficiency of our electrical grid, designed to give universal broadband access, and not just first to Kansas City and then the 45 other communities that Google's going to, and I'm grateful for that, and to Chattanooga, where the business community gave them modern broadband. I always thought we ought to have a capital budget. But if we don't, then we still got to remember we have to look at the long-term future trends and make decisions today that won't make the long-term problem worse and that will make it possible to solve it as the politics changes, as I think it will. So I want to thank the Peterson Institute for doing that. I don't think we should quit doing it. Erskine told me today he talked to 2 million people about this. So I figure he's just got a couple $100 million to go and we'll have the whole thing wrapped up.
Or at the very least, he's all talked out. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you.